The tragic thing is how far we have taken degeneration. The exciting thing is that we have no idea yet how far we might be able to take regeneration. Keystone species play a role in an ecosystem very much in the same way that a keystone holds up a stone arch. I think that is one of the major challenges.
Could you go more into how you see that mindset?
I would say that this is it's a really good question and a dangerous question. Don't try and take in all the detail. It will get in the way of your understanding. The important point really is quite simple. All the complexity here is only possible because these are uncomfortable questions. A new dimension within the ecosystem is created through the interaction. A third area, the individual subjects become objects of that area and in turn are transformed by it.
The third area that you speak with is a more real quality of self, but it's an unknown quality until it gets realized in inwardness. And so since that is so, my thoughts, my actions, my words, my deeds are, as you said, Marcus, are relevant.
It starts with an openness to explore that which is unknown. This is probably not the kind of thing that we can really politically correctly talk about. It's a great honor to be in the circle of fellow human beings who don't dismiss the subject of this evening's talk at first sight, at least not outright. I wanted to say something about myself before I get going, which is that I find myself quite dissatisfied with the world that I have inherited from my ancestors. And I'm looking for other ways that resonate with the deep feelings I have about it. And that is the origin of what I'm talking about today. And in this particular way, I found myself as one of the co-founders of a business called New Foundation Farms, as mentioned by Claudius. And together we've researched an approach to food and farming called regenerative agriculture. In the beginning, when we told people about how it all works, they said, if it's so good, why isn't everybody doing it? The slide you are looking at is one we use to explain why people don't. It's a good slide for a business presentation because it's backed up with a source reference. The International Panel of Experts in Food Sustainability put a report out in 2016 in which they articulated 8 factors that keep the world locked into agrochemical nutrient extraction, which is a kind of engineering process whereby humans mine food from the soil above ground. The economics of this process, sometimes called conventional agriculture, are very good for everyone apart from farmers. It's also disastrous for the environment, and it's also not so good for people who eat the food. So I have a question, which is, if it's so bad, why don't we stop doing it? The rational analysis on this slide may appear to give some good reasons, but I think it goes deeper than rationality and logic and science. It's about what we think about ourselves and our relationship to nature. The stories we tell ourselves matter. Conventional agriculture makes our interaction with nature a physical, chemical problem. We live within a framework of thinking that reduces the phenomena of life to physics and chemistry, and we expend an enormous amount of energy turning diverse and complex living systems into simple dead dirt. We are hastening entropy while believing that we are feeding the world. We have done our damnedest to turn Earth into one of the other planets in our solar system. It's a little as though we have made ourselves aliens on our home planet, and the encounter of a third kind, the meeting in real life with aliens on Earth, turns out to be a meeting with ourselves. I admire Stephen Hawking's genius, but his conclusion about the nature of humankind I don't share. I'm not just chemical scum. I also don't agree with the sense that humans must either be significant or insignificant. This is a binary position, a paradox. To my nose, where there is a paradox, I smell the opportunity for integration, to transcend and include the extreme positions in a higher level of understanding. Meet Leontino Balbo Jr. He's the sort of man who goes into the jungle to meditate and go on vision quests. When he comes back, he brings with him something that is harder to explain, but I'll try. Leontino has been working on the question of how uncultivated land works and why it's so resilient when farmland isn't. He took over the family operation in the state of Sao Paulo, Brazil, in the 1980s and developed a new production and harvesting system that applies the principles of regenerative agriculture in conjunction with technical innovation. This replicates the resilient regenerative ecosystem of uncultivated land. They farm on 60,000 hectares and produce 34% of the world's organic sugar. When you want to change the world, you need to measure yourself against the right sort of goals. So Leontino decided to measure the biodiversity of the Balbo farms against the Sao Paulo National Park. The result is that Balbo farms measure in at more than 50% of the biological diversity of the park. From a conventional perspective, this is an incomprehensible figure. But he says, we don't worry too much about the crop itself. We take care of the whole ecosystem. In the same interview, he goes on to say, our approach achieves 20% higher productivity than conventional sugarcane production, with genuine concern for environmental, social, and economic factors. It's the first time that an organic, large-scale initiative has produced a higher yield than conventional agriculture. The contemporary German philosopher Gerd Skobel uses the metaphor of the flying carpet to illustrate that the reality of humans is necessarily a fictional one. We dream of solid ground, but it is a delusional, even dangerous fiction. Actually, we are flying on a collective narrative web that maintains our societies. The flight or crash landing of our carpet depends on the relationship between our narrative and reality. Only that reality is not knowable once and for all. It is knowable only in the constant effort of reconciling our narrative with what we can know of reality. The psychologist Marie-Louise van Frans puts it like this: one has to do it with the way one lives, not just with the way one thinks. I've been thinking about this and about the question of whether, against the evidence, we might become a beneficial keystone species on planet Earth. Keystone species is one of those concepts which simplifies a complex matter. Keystone species play a role in an ecosystem very much in the same way that a keystone holds up a stone arch. It keeps the web of the ecosystem in place by doing its thing. The beaver, as an ecosystem engineer, turns streams into wetlands, and the wolf, as an apex predator, hunts, kills, and eats others. The impact either of them has is so much greater than their biomass relative to the rest of the ecosystem suggests, and without them, the ecosystem collapses or changes dramatically. There are farming species such as ants who herd aphids by moving them around and timing their reproduction rates to achieve the tastiest mix of green and red aphids. They do this because aphids excrete a sugary liquid called honeydew that the ants drink, much like we drink cow's milk. Ants go to great lengths to care for their aphids, often training them to release their honeydew in a way that makes it more efficient for the ants to collect the honeydew. We might say, milk the aphids, because the well-trained aphid will often withhold her honeydew until she's tickled and stroked by the ants with their antennae. Ants will also clip off their domesticated aphids' wings to prevent them from flying away when they mature. And when trouble is, ants will carry their aphids to new pastures green and protect them from predators. It's crazy when you think that ants don't have a prefrontal cortex. Surprisingly, for some humans, there are many other farming animals like termites, damselfish, ambrosia beetles, marsh periwinkles, yeti crab, and spotted jellyfish. I've been wondering whether there's a way of seeing farming less as a function of intelligence and more as a sense of inquisitive, explorative curiosity. Against the view that one independent species does something to another, we might see a web woven out of the interdependent interaction between the species. Species exist in this way, less as discrete and separate entities and more like interconnected fields. Sometimes these interactive fields are called webs, food webs. Here's an illustration of the food web of the tussock grassland in Dempster, New Zealand in the autumn. It's taken from a research paper which looks into 27 food webs around the world, revealing a sort of nestedness of keystone species complexes, which lie behind an ecosystem's structural integrity. At the center, there's a white dot with a number 0 inside. That stands for terrestrial invertebrate remains. We can follow these invertebrate remains into the soil, where we get to connect to the soil food web and the other 90%, 95% of life on land, which live below ground. Don't worry about the bewildering detail on the slide, it's deliberate, and don't try and take in all the detail. It will get in the way of your understanding. The important point really is quite simple. All the complexity here is only possible because of sunlight hitting the green leaves of plants, which convert, use, store, and exude the energy into the entire rest of the ecosystem. It's obvious, but most of our interactions with nature don't respect this point. And just for the sake of it, here's another web of life. The Wood Wide Web was the title given to the August 7th, 1997 issue of Nature, featuring forest ecologist Suzanne Simard's research into plant communication and intelligence. She's one of the pioneers of the research into tree interactions and communication using below-ground fungal networks, which has led to the recognition that forests have hub trees or mother trees, which are large, highly connected trees that play an important role in the flow of information and resourcing in a forest. Her current research investigates how these complex relationships contribute to forest resiliency, adaptability, and recovery, and has far-reaching implications for how to manage and heal forests from human impacts, including climate change. Her work describes how collaboration, not competition, is the key driver of evolution. She has over 200 peer-reviewed articles to her name and has also experienced breaking through the other side of our current scientific paradigm. The complexity of some of her experiments has made it impossible to publish in the existing peer review format. They break out of the approach in which truth is an object and the scientist is the onlooker. In her book, Finding the Mother Tree, she chooses to work with the language of the First Nations people in order to convey her experiences of and with trees. Her research has transcended being an experiment and has become life itself. Reflecting on the nature of the mother tree, she asks, if I don't give back, who am I? I had a lot more examples to share with you, but I think by now I'm ready to move on. The point is that all these webs add up. They add up to a planet. And the understanding of the interwoven nature of all these webs leads soil scientist and carbon sequestration specialist Ratan Lal to state that the health of soil, plants, animals, people, and the environment is one and indivisible. What happens to this indivisibility of the health of the nested cycles, layers, and webs of the ecosystem when it meets with a lack of human understanding is painfully yet beautifully articulated by the ecologist and writer Aldo Leopold. The cowman who cleans his range of wolves does not realize that he is taking over the wolf's job of trimming the herd to fit the range. He has not learned to think like a mountain. Hence we have dust bowls and rivers washing the future into the sea. To think like a mountain means to truly appreciate and understand the meaning of the deep relationship between wolves and deer and their interaction, which leads to the possibility of ongoing cycles of impact and rest periods, which shape the soils and grasslands, woods and forests of the mountainsides in regenerating cycles of life. The meeting of the wolf and the deer leads to something more, something new, beyond the one or the other. A new dimension within the ecosystem is created through the interaction. The psychologist Nathan Salent-Schwartz calls such an interactive field a third area. Fields were first introduced in classical physics by the 19th century physicist James Clerk Maxwell, who discovered the electromagnetic field. Maxwell struggled to find a suitable language to articulate and represent the concept. He found himself resorting to existing concepts such as moving fluids, but ultimately could not resolve that much of what he meant by field is actually non-representable. One way of understanding the field concept is as a modern reappearance of the alchemical idea of the subtle body, an intermediate realm between spirit and matter, where imaginal sight is activated in a oneness of process. The subjectivities of those in relationship affect the interactive field, but the third area also has its own objective dynamics. In this way, the third area goes far beyond what individuals do to each other. The interactive process of relationship creates a field in which the individual subjects become objects of that area and in turn are transformed by it. We can also understand the third area concept in ecological terms. The US-based regenerative practitioner and writer Ethan Soloviev talks about the life shed, which he says is like a watershed, except that all life is seen dynamically, working as one, instead of fragmenting water away from ecological, geologic, social, and cultural systems. Each life shed is seen to have its own unique essence, a singular and unfragmentable core way of processing and generating life. Everything is considered in terms of its contribution to and reciprocal relationship with the unique life shed in which it lives. This requires developing a deep understanding of the last 500 million years in each place, including special attention on the last 50,000 years and its biological, horticultural, agricultural, and human stories. The agroecological diversity of regenerative farms is inevitably a living genetic history with unique varieties of crops carrying the narratives of climatic variability, human movement, and culinary cultural evolution. Going back to alchemy, what emerges within the interactive field is a shared self, or third. The third in alchemy is the integration of paradoxes on another level, where a new and independent, unfragmented whole quality emerges. T.S. Eliot beautifully articulates this succinctly in the closing lines of his fourth of the four quartets, Little Gidding. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Another way of thinking about the third area is the architect Christopher Alexander's approach. In an essay summarizing his life's work, he wrote, "There is available to us a form of transformation, which each time it is applied, extends and enhances the wholeness of the land. And the act of using this process of transforming puts us in touch with ourselves. This means that it makes the land of the earth become more and more deeply connected to ourselves. An environment, when made in this way, may even be regarded as a vision of our inner selves." This transformation process is sometimes referred to as regeneration. Ethan Soloviev suggests that the most important thing to understand about ourselves is that all our actions exist somewhere along the continuum between degeneration and regeneration. The tragic thing is how far we have taken degeneration. The exciting thing is that we have no idea yet how far we might be able to take regeneration. What might it taste like, feel like, look like? This is why he warns against attempts to define regeneration, because like Maxwell with the electromagnetic field, we will run into the problem that our current language and understanding will limit it. Instead of trying to define regeneration from where we are now, Soloviev looks at 4 different levels of how people around the world are engaging with regeneration. There's the functional and the integrative level, and then we transition via a mindset shift into the systemic and finally the evolutionary level. What happens on the functional level is that we are very interested in processes and procedures, ingredients. We want to know about technologies and things we can do right here and now. And we are very much talking about my farm, which is somehow connected into the supply chain. Our world is very anthropocentric, and we are concerned with mitigating the damage done by what we do. When we are operating in the integrative level, we have a sense that actually humans can do good. Then something happens. There is a transition in the way we think. We become more systemic. There's a life shed that we recognize our farm or our house or home, our work to be a part of. we begin to recognize a non-linear supply ecology as opposed to a linear supply chain. Things become ecocentric rather than anthropocentric. And then on the evolutionary level is the opportunity for natural systems and human systems to co-evolve. And something happens to our way of understanding the world, which is a kind of pattern understanding of things over time and in space. Looking at things this way leads to a fundamentally different way of seeing and being in relationship with what is around us. The ability for humans to become a keystone species on planet Earth opens up when we as humans begin to see ourselves as nature itself, understanding that if we seek to develop the landscape, we must also develop ourselves. I've not come across anyone who has put it better than Ian McGilchrist. He says, the qualities of the world that come to your attention are determined by the qualities of the attention you bring to it. Aldo Leopold, mentioned earlier, describes in beautiful stark prose how the eradication of wolves across the US ultimately led to disastrous ecological decline. This is an experience that the Zimbabwean tracker, statesman and ecologist Alan Savory shared, just that he was initially involved in the killing of 60,000 elephants, when it was believed that it was the elephants that were ruining the land. After the elephants were killed, things got worse, not better. And this eventually led Savory to bring together a number of profound insights about how ecosystems function and how humans might manage land in such a way that they can work with the land and its processes. It is a decision-making framework based on how land responds to cycles of animal impact and rest, and how the timing of these leads to working with sunlight, water, minerals, and plant species, not a prescriptive set of rules. Practitioners are seen as action researchers, not operatives. He called this approach holistic management in reference to Jan Smuts' 1926 publication, Holism and Evolution. When Savory read Smuts's work, desperate to solve the elephant mystery, it hit him, and it all came together from there. A holistic perspective in management is essential because nature functions in wholes and patterns. Smuts's ideas around holism sit somewhere between science and philosophy and go deeper yet. They were described by Albert Einstein as two of the most important concepts to shape the future of humanity, second only after Einstein's own relativity theory, humble as always. Essentially, Smuts suggests that instead of focusing on the particle, we need to focus on the field and its relational qualities. Fields create wholes, and all of evolution is about ever larger nested wholes stretching through the cosmos, interlacing everything and each other. As the wholes evolve, their outer structure becomes less rigid, and inner qualities evolve. This principle he referred to as inwardness. It takes us right back to the third area as an interactive field emerging as a greater whole in relationships. Jan Smuts wrestled with language. He was unable to give the time to make his work more accessible. I have already mentioned Christopher Alexander. I found in his work someone who made Smuts's holism more accessible to me. It starts with Alexander's observation that there is an apparent paradox, which is a fundamental issue in the nature of wholeness. The wholeness is made of parts, but the parts are created by the wholeness. He says the trouble comes from referring to it as a whole. That kind of terminology seems to make it necessary for me to draw an exact boundary. That's a mistake. If I call it a center, he says, it already tells me something extra. It makes me aware of the larger patterns of things and the way this particular element fits into that pattern. Take the example of a fish pond. Let's say we want to call it a whole. To be accurate about it in a mathematical theory, he says, I want to be able to draw a precious boundary around this whole and say for each point in space, whether it is part of this set of points or not. But this is very hard to do. Obviously, the water is part of the fish pond. What about the concrete it is made of? The air, which is just above the pond? The pipes bringing the water? These are uncomfortable questions. The pond does exist. Our trouble is that we don't know how to define it exactly. When I call a pond a center, the situation changes. The fuzziness of edges becomes less problematic. The reason is that the pond, as an entity, is focused towards its center. It creates a field of centeredness. But obviously this effect falls off. The organization of the pond is caused by a field effect, in which the various elements work together to produce this phenomenon of a center. This is true physically, and it is also true mentally in my perception of that pond. The same is true for window, door, walls, or arches. None of them can be exactly bounded. They are all entities which have a fuzzy edge, and whose existence lies in the fact that they exist as centers in the portion of the world which they happen to inhabit. The general idea is that the wholeness in any part of space is the structure defined by all the various coherent entities that exist in that part of space, and the way these entities are nested in and overlap each other. The entities that come into existence in a configuration are not merely cognitive. They have a real mathematical existence and are actually occurring features of the space itself, and they have different degrees of strength. Christopher Alexander, as an architect, never had what we might want to call an Alexander style. Rather, he was interested in feeling into the patterns of place and developed processes which allow mathematical, psychological, and physical approaches to local patterns. Feelings and the sense of beauty for him were not limited to the realm of the subjective. Rather, he found them to offer a very precise and reliable instrument to decide on the design of buildings and places. When we look at wholeness as living structure, we can understand it as a central quality, which is the root criterion of life and spirit in human beings, a town, a building, a wilderness in nature. In this way, it is like the particle-wave duality in quantum mechanics, both static structure and dynamic process at the same time. This allows us to consider living structure as something literally universal and all-pervasive. It exists in space, in nature, and in any human artifact. Alexander's life's work amounts to a kind of cosmology, a third view of space. It's a unifying cosmology because it embraces both a physical world and our inner world as a coherent whole. He said, space is neither lifeless nor neutral, but a living structure, capable of being more living or less living. In the foreword to his historical novel, The Way of Weird, psychologist and shamanic consciousness researcher Brian Bates describes how the word weird, in its archaic and original sense, refers to that aspect of life which is so deep, so all-pervasive, and so central to our understanding of ourselves and our world that it is inexpressible. It connects us to all things, thoughts, emotions, events in the cosmos, as if through the threads of an enormous, invisible, but dynamic web. All the names I have mentioned in my talk today have found themselves somehow at an edge. I call it the edge of the universe. It is at this edge where the direction of things can be decided, including by human beings. As Brian Bates puts it elsewhere, the pattern of life is not woven ahead of time like cloth to be worn later as a tunic. Rather, life is woven at the very instant you live it. The experience of the web of weird takes the third area to another transcendental level, expanding it within space in the way Alexander describes it as a living structure. With these thinkers, writers, and practitioners, I've tried to give examples of how it's possible, against our tendency to want to simplify, to do the work of opening up our heart-mind and reflecting the diversity and complexity of life around us. And out of this appreciation, draw breath and take a next step that can make things more alive, more beautiful, more whole. Even if we feel that humans may be insignificant in the bigger picture, we still have a claim to be relevant in our contexts, where we are not separate from nature and the world. There we find ourselves as agents, with agency, at the edge of becoming. a keystone species of greater wholeness, greater beauty, more life, capable of deepening the living structure of a place, a landscape, a community, a home, a relationship. This is not something that science or a spiritual experience alone can do. It requires our capacity to bring both our rational faculties and faith into the third area and act in service of greater wholeness. I'd like to close with this heavily edited English translation of the 11th century Neo-Confucian Chinese philosopher called Chang Tsai. He said, "Heaven is my father and earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I finds intimate shelter in their embrace. Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my own body, and that which directs the universe I consider as my own nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions." Thank you.
What a beautiful presentation. Thank you, Marcus. I appreciate the weaving in of poetry and beautiful aesthetics into your talk. And there's a lot of these rich breadcrumbs that we can take really on each slide around this overall concept of humans as potential keystone species and how that informs our life. So how we do the Holos conversation is we first go into small groups and have some time to sort of sense-make together and answer prompt questions that help facilitate the conversation. Then we'll come together as a bigger group to continue to put content and sensibilities into this pool of understanding together. So the questions that we can consider together, I will put into the chat. Given these wonderful web of the idea of the keystone species, how can you in your everyday life contribute to this potential? And perhaps another way to think of it is, how are you being an agent at the edge of becoming? Yeah, as you can see, you can take these questions in many levels and many approaches. So feel free to use it as a jumping off point. And then after he answers, if there are others voices that want to join the dialogue, please do so as well.
The notion of exploring this living edge, I was just wondering, could you just share a little bit more about what you understand that living edge to be about? I understand it was sort of connected to the third field and that, but just in your own words, where were you going with the living edge?
I like the living edge. I think I said the edge of the universe, and the idea is that we are agents at that edge. I think the question you're asking is very much for me positioned more on the left, in the left hemisphere of the brain, as it were. We're trying to get very quickly to an abstract ingredient, as it were. And for me, this is actually more important to embrace the mystery of it, because I think the answer is going to be very, very different. There will be maybe some overlap. We all need to eat. We all have certain more basic aspects of our individuality in common, but I think that ultimately your edge is going to be decided by your feeling response. That's how Christopher Alexander went about, he died last year, went about his architectural projects. He didn't start the work until he was grabbed by some particular feeling, and then he explored that through questionnaires and so forth in order to build up an objective sense of the feeling quality that he was exploring, and admitted many mistakes in that process. But it was ultimately the edge. I think there are some things I can offer, which is, for example, food and farming. I think that's an edge that is important to all of us, where there probably are better ways of engaging than we are currently practicing. But ultimately, this third area happens to be wherever you are and whatever your life is about.
Thank you for that, because this is what I wrote down, okay, was discover and shape the living edge.
I love it.
All right. Where all things can be decided, but I would add now, because of what you just said, where all things can be felt. So I have that now as a title of a possible paper or a blog post or something. So I just wanted to come full circle and say thank you, Marcus.
Oh, thank you, Stephen.
Very, very emotionally rich, what you were saying there. Now, I just came from a work session this morning on a marketing work session on how do you engage people to understand the idea of regenerative agriculture and the need to regenerate soil and watersheds at the very basic. Because if we fix soil and watersheds, we fix everything, right? And the most fundamental technical component of regeneration is that it's hyperlocal. Because in order to repair soil, you have to look at the condition and type of soil you're dealing with, access to water, climates down to microclimates, and then the socioeconomic realities of the place itself. So it's totally at community level where it has to be initiated. Also, only at community level do people actually understand their immediate surroundings, right? So water, for example, we gave up talking about climate change because it has been politicized beyond repair at this point. But when you talk about water, right, everybody has a relationship with water, whether you're in Florida or in California or in Kansas. It's either too much of it or it's not enough of it, or it's polluted or it's poisoned. So water really resonates on an emotional level with people. And then you can explain that in order to fix your watershed, you have to fix the soil, because with every 1% increase in carbon in the soil can hold an additional 20,000 gallons of water, plus with more carbon added into the soil, it increases the penetration rate of water, which means the rains soak in like into a sponge and then the water then gets slowly released into local watersheds. It's the understanding that dead soil full of chemicals, synthetic nitrogen, phosphates, and poisons, herbicides, pesticides, when rain comes, that runs off, it runs into the watersheds, it creates massive algal plumes, dead zones in rivers and in seas and in oceans. So to make that connection to water resonates on an emotional level, but then translate all of that into helping farmers to shift and change their practices means that we all have to adapt, our menus, our recipes, our buying behavior, the way we shop, who we buy from. So you are now dealing with a systems integration way of thinking that needs to be translated and resonating, in a community to build bondage and linkages and togetherness. So to translate your story so that it resonates within a community would be such an incredible challenge. And that's what we were talking about this morning. How do you create segmentations, right, that allow you to customize your message and translate it into the context-specific world of people you're trying to reach?
Very, very rich. I think that is one of the major challenges. I sometimes have the feeling that I was born into the wrong century, sort of as a feeling response to how can this be? And then recently I started thinking, hang on, maybe this kind of thinking and this kind of meeting and this kind of conversation actually creates the pathway to that century that I think I should have been born into. And so the work you're doing, I think it's inevitably hard. If it was easy, we would have already solved it. So I think that's precisely it. It's as rewarding as it is hard. And I don't know whether we can ultimately, from this perspective, solve it with a marketing approach. I mean, I think if it would, please keep trying, because it's too important not to. But I'm wondering whether there are other ways, and I don't know what I mean by that.
I highly resonate with what Marcus was just sharing. So I would also welcome more of, more of us to join in and just share more like personal experiences of living at this edge.
Long story short, I was amazed at basically from hemp, it not only regenerates the soil, you can have up to 3 crops a year, 3 meters tall. And what you leave in the ground regenerates the soil itself. So I was wondering whether Marcus has taken that into account in the regenerative agriculture project.
I have looked at hemp, but and my response to any particular crop, so sometimes I get asked about corn or maize or wheat, how can I grow that better? For me, I think that's a very relevant question, and thank you for posting and mentioning it and posting your email. But for me, the more important question is not to start with the seed or the crop or product, but rather look at the local conditions, the market conditions, as well as the ecological conditions. What grows where you are, and what do the people there need? I don't want to create, so New Foundation Farms, or my thinking around this is not about plugging into an existing supply chain. I think we need to change the way we grow, consume, celebrate, live food. And that means that I'm not going to assume from the outset that hemp or whatever other crop is the right crop where I live. And I also think that it's never one crop. Crops usually have a history of diversity. They nurture each other, and they have all sorts of effects that go well beyond the immediate linear perspective that we might have on a particular crop. So I could encourage you to spend some time with that question as to what problem it solves in your immediate local context, for example. But that is a very, very good point. Thank you.
Listening to you, and really, really inspiring as ever. I was interested in what you were saying about the mindset shift at the center of the 4-step process through from functional, integrative, systemic, evolutionary. There is a mindset shift. That mindset shift in terms of can that be simplified down to, I think I know what you'll say, but are we talking about we are part of nature? Are we talking about a mindset shift that is different for every individual? What's the way into that mindset shift, which is so central to everyone starting to have these, or more people starting to have these conversations? Could you go more into how you see that mindset shift?
Yeah, well, I think I would say that this is it's a really good question and a dangerous question, and it's dangerous because the answer ultimately, what Ethan Soloviev offers is really a sort of self-questionnaire. Where am I, and what's my journey, and what does it look like for me in my particular context? I think my response will now be flavored by my thinking about it, and I don't want to undermine your own engagement with it. That's really important for me to say. But the way that I see it is that the fulcrum really is from anthropocentric to ecocentric, is one level of putting that. The downsizing the significance of humans in it, and the way that we've established ourselves with our global supply chains, global satellites, and everything that's around the planet is a question. What if planet Earth, what if your local ecosystem had a vote in your local parliament? What would your watershed vote for? Kind of understanding. And that there's no one-size-fits-all understanding, but it's the invitation of the life shed into yourself that I think is the mindset shift. So you're no longer working with it for your own benefit. You're working with it from you're surrendering, as it were. The mindset shift is a surrender to that third area that you create together with your community, your family, and your immediate natural environment. And the significant thing about it is that third area exists whether you acknowledge it or not. And that's the problem we've created for ourselves. So the mindset shift is the conscious entering into that space and somehow surrendering a level of control over it, I think. So that's the best I can do. And I'm looking forward to your, as ever, beautiful response.
My response is that that's a beautiful answer. It's very clarifying, and I won't take up more time now because there's many more people to talk, but it's lovely hearing you speak about this today. Really, really inspiring.
Thank you.
There's a spectrum on which the one or the other is going to contribute more to whatever impact you have as a being in the world. Which way would you say that, which one of the two, the inward or outward, would you say that that's biased towards?
Okay, thank you. I don't think I can assume a general universal answer. I can give you my answer for myself. Which
no,
is
that's what I mean.
It's taken me a long time to work out that I'm a highly introverted individual who also likes to be engaged with other people. But the engagement with other people often costs me a lot of energy. So I really love this kind of engagement. I'd prefer it more in person, but it's also brilliant that we can do this. But my gift that I declare my own gift is that I'm naturally, the way my river flows, my inner world river flows in such a way that I just can't help myself but hoover up things. I hoover up things and I want to see the pattern that connects it. And it's a bit like the talk I gave today, which I only finished 10 minutes before so I wonder where it would have gone if we'd started an hour later. But the essence of it is that this is simply how I flow. But it took me a long time to recognize that. And in that sense, I find that my capacity is one of assimilating or synthesizing information in a particular way and then sharing it. And I think that there's leverage in that, because I think that we inspire a conversation like this. But I'm not the right person to for lots of other things, and I'm hopelessly clumsy in many ways. I also have learned to admit that. So there's I think that balance, for me, that psychologically speaking, is the introverted extroverted spectrum, wherever you're on that, and go with what you're drawn to. But you need both. And last point. In our culture, I find that the introversion is often not invited, suppressed, not dealt with in a way that's helpful.
Thank you, Marcus.
I think the clumsiness is part of living or dancing at the edge, no?
Depends on who suffers.
The profound insight that is slowly starting to work through me is that the inwardness that you spoke about is not coming into the boundaries of my physical being, or is not coming into the kind of epistemology that I work with, my frame of reference that I work with. But it's actually my engagement with the nature of the cosmos. It's that the third area that you speak with is a more real quality of self, but it's an unknown quality until it gets realized in inwardness. And I think Smuts was trying to share that with us, the inwardness that, and so since that is so, my thoughts, my actions, my words, my deeds are, as you said, Marcus, are relevant. Everything I'm doing is relevant one way or another. But that quality of connectedness that has been described here seems to create the relevance into a more potential beneficial Keystone experience. is the way I'm seeing this at the moment, and I'm still grappling with it.
Yeah, I like what you say about inwardness. I would start by saying that inwardness is an openness. It starts with an openness to explore that which is unknown. So I have the Socratic stance that I know what I don't know, or I'm trying to understand that about my connection. And the other bit for me is that this is at the fulcrum of self, ultimately is a relational concept. So the inwardness that I have as a self is much bigger than just my person. It's informed by how I've reflected in the world and how the world is reflected in me. So I don't think this is bounded by my skin in any way. That's just an appearance level. And something else you said about significance or relevant, you said something about relevance, and my urgency, I urge everyone to find the courage to feel relevant. I think that comes from the place of self. Sometimes the need to feel significant gets in the way, and that for me is more of an egoic interaction.
Claudius just made me think of, we're really at a profound evolutionary inflection point where we, particularly Western culture and religion and civilization, the civilizational development has dominated the environment, right? Dominated. And in fact, I keep hearing Christian leaders continue to say that God gave us dominion over the earth, right? Now, all of a sudden, we are realizing that this earth, which is best described within the Gaia hypothesis, which is really a well-accepted mental construct, is turning this upside down, and we are finding ourselves to be embedded in a system that has a life of its own, that actually dominates everything, and it dominates us as a species. And so when you talk about Keystone species, right, we are embedded in this enormous power that we don't fully understand, that we don't understand at all, and that is starting to roll up and plant itself into our awareness and consciousness now as a force that will absolutely dominate us. And so we have to basically run to adapt, to mitigate, to cushion the worst impacts of how this life force may respond to our presence and our engagement within it. So that sort of is, to me, an overwhelming presence. And thank you, Marcus, for framing it the way you did.
What you made me mindful of a bit that came up in the breakout room that I was in. She was talking from her own relationship with horses. And she said that one of the difficulties we have in riding horses is that we often try to control the horse. And her experience of that was that the horse then might respond to that in a way that is appropriate to the control. But what we've not done is entered into a space in which we create a greater system of rider and horse. And so she was raising lots of questions about it. And that somehow ended up in what you've just alluded to, which is this vexed question of number of people on planet Earth, and in how far our actions and our numbers elicit a response appropriate to our attempts to control a horse, with climate change, sixth extinction event, and so forth unfolding. Kerry also said this is probably not the kind of thing that we can really politically correctly talk about. And my contribution was that talk about human numbers on planet Earth goes against the sense of freedom that we have. So I'm not really sure how to go about it, but I'm loving the reflections. Thank you so much. I feel that I've entered into a deep third area with all of you. The thing I was wrestling with is that as a boy, I had Stephen Hawking's book, I forget what it's called, and it had sort of on the cover like an infolded structure, like an MC Escher illustration of the universe. And I always imagined that the edge of the universe is somewhere out there, and I'm here, and then as time went by, I suddenly thought, hang on, as in now, I don't understand all dimensions, but I understand space-time a little bit better than I did as a child. And it means that actually the unfolding is happening into a dimension that there isn't an out there, as in this is right here. I mean, and it's not special to me. You're all on that same edge, and so are all other planets and the whole universe. So but at the same time, it's pretty special to be here on that edge and to somehow have this tiny capacity to consciously reflect on it as a start, and then through somehow understanding it, engage with it in a way that's generative. It just gives me goosebumps. Thank you for triggering that thought.
Marcus, may I share something?
Go for it.
It's just a word play. And because I shared with you about the living edge, the notion of the edge, then there probably means if there's an edge, there's a little bit of a ledge that goes with that, right? Well, if you understand that there is the edge, there's the ledge, then if we know that, then we have knowledge.
Nice.
And it's a play, like I like to play with words. So as I'm gaining my knowledge, I have a ledge that I can tippy toe to that allows me to then go to the edge and look over. It's not way out there, it's actually right here kind of idea.
Yeah.
And that's how knowledge, if we allow it to co-create and eco-create and those kind of things.
I think I've got younger while I was talking, and I'm now at the age where I am watching Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons. And I see Coyote running out into empty space and only realizing minutes later that he is no longer on the firm ground, and he doesn't have knowledge.
Yeah. And the other thing that I always talk about is, you know, you go to make your first step, that's not really a commitment, it's the second step is the commitment, right? Because you can always pull back the first step. So if you're at the knowledge, it's not necessarily, it's that second step where you really go for it. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm just going for it now. You know, I'm at that point in life where I'm looking for the rocking chair, but I'm going for it. So,
yeah, looking down into nothing. And the thought was, if I go over now, I'll be everything, nothing in the same concept, everything, nothing. And I thought, what was that about? But it's just, yeah. Marcus, lovely, brilliant, well done.
Thank you.
Well
Thank
done.
you so much.